As I've noted previously, there are some critics of U.S. social welfare programs who suggest that if people would only get a job and work hard, stay in school and graduate college, they'd be less likely to be poor. We've looked at the obstacles to that in the real world regarding employment and regarding education. Now, those same critics, perhaps none more prominent than Charles Murray, say that if people would not have children without being married first, they'd also be less likely to be poor. As Murray said, leading up to welfare reform in the 1990s, illegitimacy is the central social problem of our time, and its spread threatens the underpinnings of a free society. The main reason for scrapping welfare is to reduce the number of babies born to single women. There's an additional characteristic of women who are at most risk of giving birth to children out of wedlock. They generally have low intelligence. I should note as a footnote that there is arguably no one who was more influential in the drafting of welfare reform in the 1990s than Charles Murray. So let's look at some of the data about these issues. And first thing is that we should note that overall, across the entire population, birth rates have been pretty flat for decades. And despite what you might think from watching TV news and reading the paper, teenage birth rates have been in steady decline for decades. It's not just birth rates, but in fact, teen pregnancy, birth rates, and abortion rates have all been in decline for decades. Now, that said, we still have much higher teen birth rates than other countries. Any guesses as to why? Well, part of the answer is that other countries with universal health care can offer better access to free or inexpensive birth control, thing one. And two, most of these other countries have better and more integrated programs of comprehensive sex education. Indeed, there's a pretty clear correlation between income and unintended pregnancy. Birth control is expensive, and lack of access to it can have some real consequences. Still, while overall birth rates are in decline, teen birth rates are in decline, it is absolutely true that non-marital births outside of marriage, have been on the rise. But I want to argue that that is not necessarily a bad thing, and in fact, that rise in non-marital birth rates may be an indicator of social progress. Out-of-wedlock birth rates are not on the rise because birth rates are on the rise, as we now know. Part of why they're on the rise is that marriage rates have been declining pretty radically. But this is often a good thing. I mean, after all, it was not all that long ago that women had very few avenues open to them for survival apart from dependence on a man, right? First their fathers, then their husbands. With a few exceptions, school teacher, nurse, social worker, women were excluded from the labor market. We should sort of talk about northern white women here, and often had no choice but to marry. That's no longer the case. Women do not have to get married, and many, more and more, choose not to, or more commonly, to delay marriage and get married later. This is a success of second wave feminism. This is a mark of progress. Out-of-wedlock birth rates are also on the rise because divorce has risen. This is another indicator that can sometimes make people a bit hysterical, but this too, I think of as a positive indicator. Again, not that long ago, if a woman found herself in an unhappy or an unsafe marriage, she had very few options available to her. That's no longer the case. Men and women alike can end unions that do not meet their needs. That's another success of second wave feminism. And both the declining marriage and rising divorce rates are patterned we see all across the post-industrial world as women have more and more choices available to them. Just as a footnote here, we should also note that divorce surge has been flattening out, so it's no longer sort of on the rise. It may have, in fact, plateaued a little bit. All right, I just made reference to the fact that we see these patterns all around the world, right? Rising divorce rates and declining marriage rates. Here's the difference, though. Look at that blue line. And you can see that quite a lot of countries actually have higher rates of births taking place outside of traditional marriage than in the United States. But it's in the U.S. where that is most likely to guarantee poverty. That's the red line there. Instead of bemoaning the fact that more and more children are being born outside of old-fashioned ideas of the ideal family structure, we could accept that this is how people want to organize their lives now and help them do that as other countries do, with programs of universal childcare that make it possible for single parents to work, with greater protections against wage discrimination, with broader-based programs of family support, child allowances, mandatory paid leave, and so on. We have decided to make the connection between single parent and poverty direct in the United States. But this is not a law of nature. It is a choice of public policy. Note, by the way, and we've looked at this before, I believe, married couple poverty in the United States is higher than child poverty in these Nordic countries. So even in the United States, marriage will not get you lower poverty rates than you would have in other countries. There's another piece of the puzzle here, though, because out-of-wedlock births are on the rise across all groups, but they are, in fact, rising faster among poor and low-income people and among women of color. Now, why is this more prevalent in low-income communities? Well, if part of the purpose of traditional marriage is to create a stable economic environment to raise children in, low-income men would not be a great choice as husbands, merely for practical reasons, right? You can see here how this plays out. Higher-income men are much more likely to be married than low-income men. They make better husbands, not necessarily better fathers. They make better husbands simply because they better provide the stable finances for child rearing. Now, a related part of why marriage rates are lower in low-income communities is that because of other laws and discriminatory enforcement of them, we have stripped lots of low-income communities of color of the men who might serve as husbands. They can't because they are unavailable. This also means, by the way, that more and more children, especially African-American children, have an incarcerated parent. If you want more low-income men to marry, then one thing you might do is send fewer of them to prison for nonviolent drug and so-called public order offenses. But none of this should be read to suggest that simply because poor and low-income men of color are less likely to marry the mothers of their children, that they are uninvolved in their children's lives or are inattentive parents. Fact. There's a growing body of research that suggests that low-income men of color are actually as or even more involved in the care of their children than are white fathers. It is time to put to bed the myth of the absent black father, or the idea that poor parents are inherently inferior, or that it's poor parenting that makes children poor. Finally, to return to the claim that poverty is at heart a supposed moral failure or rooted in behavioral causes, and that to end poverty, people simply need to stay in school, get a job, get married. The truth is that a majority of poor have in fact gotten married and graduated from high school, but nonetheless remain poor. It's a structural problem. It's not a behavioral problem.